Hello, I'm Dr. Randall Bach, and I'm honored today, January 26th, to have with me Will Jones, PhD, right from Royal Leamington Spa, or Leamington Spa, England. I was fortunate enough to meet him last week or so in England on my peregrination sojourn through the lovely country, and my meeting with Will was one of the highlights. He is the editor of the Daily Sceptic. It's a must-read. It began as the Lockdown Daily or something like that, and has turned into the Daily Sceptic, which I have to say is somewhat eponymous with my own existence. I wake up skeptical, I go to sleep skeptical, so I'm a daily skeptic myself, and I assume Will is as well. Tell us a little about your journey to the Daily Sceptic and who and what you are prior and now.
Hi, Randall. Thanks for having me on. Privileged to be here to talk about these important things. As you said, I'm Dr. Will Jones, PhD. I'm editor of the Daily Sceptic. We began in April 2020 as Lockdown Sceptics, a blog set up by conservative journalist Toby Young, well known for setting up the Free Speech Union, which your listeners might just possibly have heard of, which is making some big waves in this country, in the UK, in terms of free speech and pushing back against the huge clamping down on free speech and censorship that we've been seeing. It was set up just before the pandemic, actually, in response to, because those concerns were building, but of course has really come into its own during the pandemic. That's the Free Speech Union. Toby Young set up Lockdown Sceptics as a blog when he realized that the whole world had gone insane during March 2020, and that there needed to be a contrary voice. But so much of the mainstream media, and he's a mainstream journalist, he would write in the mainstream media, but so much of it was just not open to skepticism about anything to do with the pandemic and COVID and lockdowns. And subsequently, of course, vaccines, the COVID vaccines, and so he set that up. Got huge traction, especially when he published a seminal criticism of Neil Ferguson's lockdown model, the notorious Imperial College lockdown model that's predicted huge numbers of deaths in the UK, in the US, around the world from the first wave of COVID, hugely overstating those deaths. He published a critique of that by an ex-Google software engineer that went viral and really boosted the popularity of the site. That made a major impact way back in the spring of 2020, and Lockdown Sceptics developed from there. I came on board as a writer in the autumn of 2020, and then started working more and more for the site over the course of 2021. It was in due course renamed the Daily Sceptic as the lockdowns were gradually released, and there was hope that we were going to go back to normal, or the so-called new normal, if that's if the WF and people associated with that have their way. And we changed the Daily Sceptic, and I became editor of the Daily Sceptic in 2022, at the beginning of 2022. So I've been doing that now for 2 years, and it has flown by. It's all flown by, which must be a sign of having a good time, as they say.
Well, I appreciate your work there, and I think you're an excellent writer. How do I know that? When I read your work, it just kind of flows by. It's I think the sign of a good writer is somebody who's able to transmit the information, but without being too heavy-handed. I'm not sure I quite qualify that in that role myself. I'm perhaps a little bit dogmatic, but your scope is quite broad. What are the we'll just kind of go over the recent kind of breadth and issues that you've been covering. I can post some of them, but what's top of mind for the Daily Sceptic in the last, say, month or so?
In the last month, well, we've been so we were focused very initially, of course, on lockdowns and all the extreme response there. That's way back. And then we moved into obviously that continued, but then when the vaccines came out and as the side effects of those and the serious side effects started to emerge, we started putting out more about the vaccines and worries about that. And then as things developed and as we started to go back to more like normal, we also moved into skepticism of other areas, particularly where there's a politically driven agenda of a so-called scientific consensus, which doesn't really exist because the dissident and dissenting scientists are suppressed, and so the major area there, of course, that your listeners have probably picked up on is climate alarmism, the idea that the carbon dioxide is the knob, the control knob for how hot the Earth gets. That nothing else really matters, and that it's because humans are burning lots of fossil fuels in particular that the Earth is going to get catastrophically hot. That's obviously well-known climate. That's what we refer to as on the site as climate alarmism, and we counter that. We're skeptical about that, not skeptical about the fact that the climate is changing, but skeptical about what may be behind all those changes and how catastrophic it really is likely to be, and also how practical and realistic a lot of the measures are that we're pursuing to try to address that. So we've been doing quite a lot on climate skepticism since mid of 2021 and increasingly in 2022, and so that's so the last month that's been a major focus. But also, of course, the ongoing COVID stories. We have, of course, the vaccines. As there continue to be revelations about that. That's obviously a major scandal that's been occurring over the last 3 years, and we continue to cover that as that slowly emerges and people slowly begin to accept. This is more widely, that is, rather just among the skeptic community, they begin to accept that there may actually have been a serious problem, and a serious ongoing problem perhaps as well. So we've been covering a lot of that, and of course the pandemic treaty, what the World Health Organization and the United Nations are up to with these attempts to change the international arrangements about how we respond and prepare for pandemics, and particular concerns about whether those responses are going to undermine national control and national sovereignty of the of pandemic responses. We think that there's good and strong indications that they are going to undermine those things, because as a matter of international law, the pandemic treaties and and in particular the changes to the international health regulations will change it from being a advisory role that the World Health Organization plays in a pandemic, an emergency, a self-declared emergency, I should add. The World Health Organization decides, and in particular the chief of the World Health Organization has sole decision about whether there is or is not an emergency. And in an emergency, under the changes that are proposed, it will become obligatory under international law to follow what the World Health Organization says in terms of NPIs, so non-pharmaceutical interventions, restrictions, in terms of medical interventions, vaccines, etc., mandates, all that kind of thing. If the World Health Organization were to say you must do this, then under the matter of international law, the changes will mean that countries are required to do that. Now, critics say, yes, but it's only international law. There's no way of enforcing it. There's international courts, but these things don't really go to court. And even if they did, countries can't be made to do it. So they argue that these things aren't really undermining national sovereignty, and you'll see that in a number of fact checks. But really, that's just showing contempt for international law. What's the point in having international law if it's not supposed to be something that people follow? So we're quite concerned. We're very concerned that by making these things a matter of international law, it obviously increases the moral pressure on countries and the political pressure on countries to fall in line. But also, it's anyone who takes international law seriously, and let's be honest, a lot of even if we personally may not take international law seriously, a lot of people who run countries or run governments and in the what you might call the elite, among the elites, global elites, they take it very seriously. And so we can imagine that this would have a big impact on how a pandemic would be responded to, and we would anticipate seeing the World Health Organization in the driving seat, which in fact is the point, of course, of the changes, to put the World Health Organization in the driving seat. I'm sure your listeners don't need to be to have explained why it would be a problem to have one person in the world, the chief of the World Health Organization, is solely responsible for determining and dictating what countries,
especially when the track record, the history is less than stellar. My expertise recently has been in Zika. I think that was a total flop. And if you go back further, we can discuss that later. But clearly their COVID analysis was off. It was politically driven, motivated, and disastrous. And as far as the world health, if you just kind of leave the term a little bit loose, if you think about global health, what determines that? I mean, when I decide how I'm feeling on a given day, a lot of it, not just my blood pressure or my, some kind of physical signs. It's a lot of my outlook. What's on my prospect today? Do I have work to do? Do I have a place to go? Can I go outside? A lot of what the World Health Organization perhaps focused on was a safetyism approach, which was myopic and laser focused on this one aspect of a viral test, which may or may not be pathognomonic of any particular disease, and in the wrong cohort, young people and whatnot showing positive for a COVID test, their lives have to change, have to be locked down and whatnot, whether it's indicative of their own physical health or not. So they're and again, this is one of these discourses I apologize for, but I think there's a tendency we've seen in the United States, for instance, of legislators kind of acquiescing and shedding their responsibilities to bureaucracies. So there's a law here. I'm not going to get too far into it because it's under the rubric Chevron, the oil company, which has been a little bit of a wedge issue about how much the bureaucratic state should be doing, making their own laws. They make the Environmental Protection Agency here, which makes its own laws about rivers and what, and then it winds up being, what size toilet you have to have and things you have to do in your house. And the legislators like, oh, that's not us, that's the EPA. And it seems to me that it's a very easy way for the legislators not to take responsibility either way. It's like, that wasn't me, that was somebody else doing it. That's the WHO in this case. Our hands are tied, and I think it's a crutch, to use another health term, and a disability, of our system, to have legislators, kind of take away responsibility. And I'm just wondering, given that in the context of England's having voted Brexit in, and then trying repeatedly to have it enacted and done poorly overall, or without full intent and force of perhaps the voters' needs and requirements, do we see this in England? Is England just going to become another EU? I interviewed with Andrew Bridgen about 10, 12 days ago, and he was talking about kind of the actual apparatus, the intelligence agencies, all that kind of stuff in the UK being subservient to the EU. Is this just one bit of like, we don't want to govern, and we kind of wind up with a mushy uniparty at the helm?
Yeah, it does feel like that, doesn't it? You definitely get a sense that governments like to outsource the responsibility to NGOs, to quangos, to these quasi non-government organizations, and then of course to global bodies like the World Health Organization. So there is that worry that they would want to outsource the pandemic responsibility to a World Health Organization. That's actually something that they would welcome. And as you noted, that there's this idea of what is health. And the World Health Organization, this is another concerning aspect of it, has this agenda called One Health, which basically defines health so broadly that it covers every aspect of life, because anything in a sense, can be put under health and well-being. If you bring well-being under health, then everything's about could be defined in terms of what makes people feel happy or their lives go well. So and they have defined it. You have, and then you have things like climate, predictably, inevitably, climate change coming under this One Health agenda. So you start to wonder, well, might there be a risk that they might at some point declare a climate change health emergency, and therefore, and the World Health Organization starts dictating what countries should and shouldn't do. It sounds fanciful, but if you look at what they're actually proposing, their agenda for One Health, you can see that it does actually include those climate aspects, and not just that. It's just, it makes their agenda so broad. You just think, well, what's left to politics if they're putting everything under health, and then having this treaty that makes us subservient to the Director General's decisions whenever there's an emergency that the Director General declares. And it's worth mentioning, actually, that there was the monkeypox so-called emergency. Monkeypox hardly did anything. Hardly anyone was infected. Hardly anyone died. It was largely a non-event, and yet the Director General asked his committee to decide whether it should be classified as an emergency. Now, the committee, actually, the majority of them anyway, said no, we don't think it is a global emergency. So there's some wisdom there. They didn't all say that, but most of them did. But, and this was really telling, the Director General decided that since it was his decision, and he's right that it was, that he decided to declare a public health emergency of international concern anyway, and therefore engage all those powers, and in the future would engage all the powers, and they'd be obligatory, as we say, under international law. So big worries around that. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I think that I covered that somewhat because I wrote an article for Brownstone on Donald McNeil, the former chief science writer at the New York Times. It's called The Marvelous Mr. McNeil, and monkeypox filters in because after his defrocking at the New York Times for reasons unrelated to pandemics, and his declaring that we should go medieval on the coronavirus, and what does that mean? And maybe we did. He became, I hate to use this word, but let's try it out, a shill for monkeypox. And he took his Substack, and he's still rather influential. He's an excellent writer, and otherwise a smart guy, perhaps taken away by safetyism. But he kind of took up the mantle of monkeypoxism, and I think the hidden theme there is that there's a vaccine potential treatment for monkeypox. So he was kind of on this endless monkeypox scheme, and previously he had written for and about and with I can't remember his name, kind of a multi-millionaire, I'm not sure quite, billionaire, who had taken over a potential monkeypox vaccine. And that had military ties. I'll have to pull up the article at some point. But to make it short and sweet, there are certain illnesses that fall into categories of which there might be a vaccine, and those which might not have one. Treating, so let's say I mentioned earlier, blood pressure, whatever, doesn't quite yet have a vaccine. That's not on the forefront. HIV could have, maybe, should have, possibly had a vaccine, but we haven't been able to do that because it's kind of an immune system itself. That's kind of on the back burner. I would venture to say that HIV continues to cause much more of a public health threat ever than COVID did, certainly more than monkeypox, certainly more than Zika. And that's not much spoken about by the WHO. And I think, and I'm wondering whether you can comment on this, whether, we all serve somebody, right? We may not serve God, we're serving some God. Who is the WHO's God?
I think that, so in terms of who's the god of the WHO, in a sense, that's like asking whose agenda is it serving, what goal, ultimate goals is it pursuing, which is a really interesting question. there's lots of theories about that. Okay, of course, and some of them would be termed conspiracy theories. But then we shouldn't necessarily assume that global elites aren't conspiring in certain ways. So we shouldn't dismiss them simply because it's got some conspiratorial element. I think profit is a major motive. There's rich people who like to get richer. There's people who want to get rich off this. There's major companies, pharmaceutical companies, who are always on the lookout for how they can maximize their profits. And I think that definitely plays a role. And we've seen that. We've seen companies can act extremely ruthlessly when they feel they can get away with it, in terms of the way they make medicines, the way they go about trying to make medicines, and the way they hide and cover up the harmful effects of those medicines, and cover up the lack of efficacy as well. So there's definitely a profit motive. I think I would say that there's quite a kind of messianic kind of save the world motive as well going on. I think that some of these people, I do get criticized for this because people think I'm not cynical enough, but I do think that a lot of these people who are involved, or a number of them, really do think that they're trying to save the world, and they think that the ends justify the means, and that they are so that they are trying to these grand agendas of trying to get a vaccine to eradicate certain diseases. So they believe. So you've got Bill Gates, for example, who I'm sure is trying to make money, although he's already got a lot. But a lot of money is never enough for some people. But I do think that he has got this idea that with all his money he should try to make the world a better place. And the way he's trying to make the world a better place is by curing diseases, by finding and funding those medicines and vaccines that will do it. So there is this idea, and so of course that ties in very nicely with the profits with the profit motive of the pharmaceutical companies, and so you have this big agenda, and especially when, as you noted, Randall, that when there are these diseases that in particular are susceptible or appear to be susceptible to a vaccine solution, then there's a lot of interest in those, because there's this whole global effort and agenda to find and create vaccines. And in particular, before the pandemic, there was this big push to try to use genetic-based vaccines, mRNA in particular, and other genetic-based vaccines, and to try to use those as a way of producing vaccines on a platform. This idea of mRNA being a platform that could produce vaccines quickly and easily, and possibly be able to, because it's the same platform, therefore speed up the process of testing them, because supposedly they will, if they've tested the platform for safety, then they think that they will have therefore be able to bypass a lot of the tests for future iterations of that same platform. So these ideas were all there before the pandemic, very influential ideas, and the pandemic was an absolutely huge golden opportunity for these people, the vaccine savior narrative and the pharmaceutical companies, to advance that, to get that technology, which has been struggling. They haven't managed to get a single mRNA product approved before the pandemic. It was really struggling to get through because of safety problems, largely. And this was a golden, huge opportunity that they grabbed with both hands, and the regulators as well, who are keen to do it as well, to get this technology through. Which is what they've done, and now they intend to build on that, as we can see, and they're using the so-called success of the mRNA vaccines to really try to push more similar technologies, and we keep reading about that all the time.
Yeah, no, I think you're onto something there, and my peregrinations through the Zika world, researching my book Overturning Zika. I actually began on that book before COVID was a thing, before SARS-CoV-2 had become a household word, and COVID and pandemic and all that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, after the book was published, I came upon this article, which I think is a little bit of a smoking gun. Let me see if I can put it up for us. but it brings kind of 3-4 key things together. But Bill and Melinda Gates are placing bets on this biotech in the race to develop a Zika vaccine. So I came upon this later when I was researching Zika, and I'm going to try to make this a little bit larger for us. Moderna Therapeutics, blah blah blah. U.S. Human Health and Human Services is going to put $125 million. The Gates Foundation has pledged to give Moderna up to $100 million to develop mRNA-based vaccines for infectious diseases. So this is something before COVID. This article is 2017, and it's got a lot of the themes that we're talking about here. There was a push for mRNA. Now there didn't Zika as an illness or as a phenomenon. That's not really an illness. Zika is not a human illness. It's a mild, probably monkey dengue virus. But the syndrome of Zika supposedly causing microcephaly was caused to do this same thing. It's redolent of the climate thing, where no matter what thing they find, whether it's warming, whether you have a lot of snow or no snow, this or that, whatever it happens to be, this always has the same answer. We have to bring more kind of government control and limit people's lives in one way or another. In this case, whatever the virus comes along, the answer is this mRNA platform. We have to kind of jumpstart this thing. And I speak to an analogy. I happen to currently be a Tesla owner, and I love my Tesla, but I don't see it as a way of saving the Earth, because I have this electric car. Because I understand that it's really a coal-powered car. But I love the tech aspect of it and convenience and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, but I think there's an analogy of having to jumpstart an industry. We've seen all the subsidies for electric cars, and that winds up, you get the thing, but you get it perhaps, you get it definitely in advance of the economic purpose for it. And so you've pushed it really hard, and there's all kinds of squeezing through the toothpaste that lead to deformities and distortions of the toothpaste tube itself as the aftermath and the economy. So companies wind up being kind of whipsawed into doing certain things which may or may not be economical. We're seeing this a lot of the fallout from the electric vehicle, say, drop in interest once some of the subsidies run out. I think Toyota is going to wind up being fairly successful because they, managed to, blinder themselves to some of the, electronic vehicle, stimuli and, heroin shots, metaphorically speaking. I wonder, there might be a question in there. I don't know if you want to talk on some of the aspects of the EV analogy to, the way these things get externally pushed.
Yeah. It's a good analogy. Yeah, you've got these technologies that aren't really ready, and they've got problems. We keep seeing record 200% growth in deaths from electric bike fires in New York. It was reported this week, and three electric London buses which spontaneously burst into flames just this month, and in one city in London. So this is an indication of a technology that. That's just one of there's a number of issues with the technology. I mean, the technology, as you say, there's some really good things about the technology. The cars they actually produce can be have typically much higher performance than the petrol-based and diesel-based versions. So I'm not down on the technology as such, but is it the answer? Is it the solution? Is it possible? Is it realistic for all transport, all cars, all personal cars, all public transport, all logistics to trucks and lorries? Is it possible for all of that to go electric? Is that realistic? Also, are there problems with the technology that we've blinkered ourselves to because is it an unripe technology because we're so desperate to push it through? It does seem to have an unfortunate propensity to spontaneously burst into flames, and this is increasingly causing problems, injuries, deaths. So there are definite analogies with the vaccines, with the mRNA vaccines, which were pushed through in record time. I mean, incredible to get a vaccine approved and being rolled out within 9 months or something ridiculous, wasn't it? And the aim of the Gates funded international bodies is a vaccine in 100 days. That's what it's that's their strapline, 100 days, which is around about 3 months.
And the thing is, I'm not necessarily opposed to mRNA technologies. I think down the road, I'm older than you, I believe, and I'm older than I used to be. I'm older than I frankly was yesterday, and I imagine I'm going to continue getting older unless something else intervenes. And at some point, if I get my, God forbid, cancer, this and that, if there's an mRNA platform that can kind of somewhat personalize some modality of treatment, blah blah blah, I don't think it's necessarily a horrible idea. I don't think that all electric devices are bad. I think they need to come about in somewhat more of an organic, planned, peer-reviewed, understood fashion, and not abjuring and ignoring and throwing out the current technologies. When you talk about the speed with which the mRNA vaccine came out for COVID, I think what people ignore is that Johnson & Johnson and Janssen, almost synonymous, came out with the adenovirus version of same. There was a regular flu shot variety modality, adenovirus carrier platform, whatever you want to call it, old style flu shot version of the COVID vaccine in the same time frame. There was no real huge add-on for having the mRNA modality for this vaccine. And aside from the fact that it got to be kind of this, in my view, a forced experiment on billions of people, and just to see what happens. I personally, I did not really want to take a vaccine. I held out as long as I could because I didn't think I was in the risk group category. I'm pretty slim and fit, and play tennis. I get good cardiac profile, blah blah blah. And despite my advanced years, I didn't really see any point to it. My cohort was not getting dropping dead from COVID, nor getting much in the way of illness. Anyway, but at some point, because of travel, because of this and that, logistics, society, lockdowns, forcing this and that, cards, I want to take. Anyway, I chose the J&J because you possibly sacrificed some mild version of efficacy, 10% or something like that, but you had something that was a safer, more, at least more proven platform. And there were other modalities of vaccine, the Sinovac and the Covaxin, which are what I call like freeze-dried virus that China, India, Russia had, and it was Sputnik and whatnot, that people took, and I don't think they necessarily had the same side effect profile the mRNAs did. I don't know if you can speak to any of that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, right, with the mRNA technology, could it potentially be good for cancer or whatever? I mean, potentially, but of course they've been trying to develop it for decades and struggling to get something that was safe and effective. They're going to keep trying, and it'll be interesting to see what they come up with. But one of the problems is one of the outcomes of this pandemic has been more people, including myself now, are much more suspicious of the claims that pharmaceutical companies make about their drugs. Now I read a study, especially a trial results from a funded and run by a pharmaceutical company, and I think, can I really trust this? Is when they say it's got efficacy, is that really how effective it is? When they say it's this safe, is that really how safe it is? How have they managed to get those favourable figures, which they're so desperate to get in order to justify the huge sums that they spend developing and trialing these these drugs? So there's that issue. I think there's the question of to what extent do we think we can trust it? But in principle, sure, there's we all want there to be effective medicines that can help us, and in principle, something with a genetic basis could help. I just hope that I don't have to be one of the first. And in terms of the Janssen vaccine, which is similar to the Oxford or AstraZeneca vaccine in this country, so they're as you say, an adenovirus vector vaccine. It's been really interesting with that to see how that's been denigrated by the authorities, both this side of the Atlantic in the EU and in the UK, and then also particularly in the States. I think in the UK we resisted that denigrating of that vaccine because it was the Oxford vaccine, so we had a kind of patriotism about it, I think, and the EU was particularly negative about it, I think, for the same reason, because it was a UK vaccine and they're still smarting over Brexit. So that might be explained by that. But I think the really interesting case is the United States, where the Johnson and Johnson vaccine, the CDC, the health authorities, were much more upfront about the side effects, the health risks.
They were not. I don't think it was a level playing field.
No, exactly, not at all. They were much more upfront about there being deaths, the blood clots, of course, in particular, the problem of the VITT, the blood clotting problem, and really suppressing that vaccine quite soon afterwards. And this has been attributed, and I think rightly, to there being institutional preference for the mRNA technology. The mRNA technology being the preferred technology of the global bodies, of the Gates-funded bodies, of the American, of the NIH and the health bodies there. They'd really been pushing and sponsoring and developing mRNA technology in particular. And I don't know how welcome the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and this alternative technology really was to them. In any case, the facts are that they've been much more upfront. I think they still, in America, have still not acknowledged a single death from the mRNA vaccines, which is insane considering how many were reported to their adverse event to theirs.
VAERS.
Yeah. And but they have with the adenovirus vaccines and have recommended people don't use them anymore in favor, of course, of the mRNA vaccines, which are continue supposedly to be entirely safe and entirely effective. So that was an interesting dynamic, and I think showed another way that agenda. You can see that it's driven by agendas of what we call the elites, which is just a shorthand for the people with the power and the money.
I think you and I can possibly agree that Andrew Bridgen, I'm not sure particularly his background, but he's probably not of the elite these days. He's been expelled from the Conservative Party, so he's a party of one. He has been fighting back against the COVID vaccine for children. Has he been successful? Is there kind of popular pushback against this kind of meretricious, overplay of their hand? What do you think about vaccines for this COVID vaccine for children? Now, I say this at the risk of getting deplatformed myself, speaking of platforms from YouTube. My Andrew Bridgen video from about a week ago or so caused a strike on my YouTube channel, and was quickly, it just disappeared by them. I just as a slight preface, I had Recep Levy, a professor at MIT, on my show almost a year ago today, and his ground, it wasn't a revolutionary claim. He was pointing out that children never really got sick from COVID. That whatever risk there happens to be, and he's not claiming any particular one, but there's some risk with anything. Whatever risk there was from the vaccine was greater than the risk from the illness itself for children, and children should not get the COVID vaccine. That destroyed my erstwhile YouTube channel entire. So I had, I'm not sure how many thousands of subscribers I had, but that just disappeared. I have not been able to recreate that one. Is that going on in England? Was MP Bridgen's effort successful? What are attitudes towards these repeated COVID vaccines? Is it going to be placed on the general ledger for children, 5-10 years from now, that they have to get a COVID vaccine? Is it happening in the EU? Is it happening in the UK? Is it happening?
Right. Because in the States, it's on the childhood schedule, isn't it? Is that right?
I believe.
Incredible. No, that kind of thing hasn't really hasn't really happened so much here. They've backed off. We're not quite so vaccine fanatical, our health authorities here. I mean, we are a bit, but I think not so much. Not like the CDC and the federal authorities in America, which seem to be completely captured by the vaccine agenda and industry. I don't believe that children's COVID vaccines for children are recommended and certainly not mandated for children. The vaccines for children are very controversial here. The JCVI, which was the official advisory body for the government on whether the vaccines were safe, specifically when asked back in 2021, refused to endorse the vaccines for children. They were not convinced by them, and very controversially, the government and the government's chief medical officer overruled their advisory body in order to authorize the vaccines for children. So they were allowed to have them, but it was very controversial here, and really vaccines for children had a very low take up, and didn't really, the COVID vaccines didn't really take off.
All right, so I'm going to segue to make best use of our time, because I have a couple other looming questions for Will Jones, PhD, Daily Sceptic editor. You've been very knowledgeable and authoritative about some of the lab leak foundations. I'm wondering if you would care to discuss some aspects of that, and potentially also we could possibly segue into the question amongst some of the skeptics of whether there was a pandemic. You know, we'd have to kind of categorize what that question means. But perhaps you can take us into the world of Wuhan, EcoHealth, Ralph Baric, Zheng Li Shi, and so forth.
That'd be good. I just want to say on the last topic before we move on, just to answer your question, that Andrew Bridgen, I think, has been very much shunned, but has increasingly been gaining traction. He keeps having debates in Parliament, and the debate, I think it was last week, was the best attended so far with MPs and peers. So he is having some success and getting more traction than he had before, although it's still very, very slow going. So I just wanted to say that. So good on him for keeping pushing that agenda in Parliament. Lab leak, lab origins. So there's been lots of revelations around that recently, hasn't there? We keep having emails being leaked out from the time. Keep getting little dribs and drabs more. The teams, the guys at Public and Michael Schellenberger and what was the other one? Anyway, the other one that's associated with that have been getting some good scoops on that. I think I have to say that it's pretty clear. It's very clear that the virus was engineered. That more evidence keeps coming out on that. We've had a new. The first people who saw it, you can actually see the very first people who saw it, who first identified it in China in the last week of 2019. Their first thought was, has this come out of a lab? So it was the very first thought of the very first person who identified it in the last week of China. And then it was the first thought of Robert Redfield, he said, the CDC director, when he first heard about it on the 1st of January. It was the first thought, Shi Zhengli said, of the WIV. She said that it was her first thought. Did it come out of my lab? And she claims that she went and checked. And she claims that it didn't come out of her lab, but then she published a paper in mid-January publishing the rat G13, the closest sample from her lab, and saying, we have this sample, this is the closest sample, it's 96% similar, but this virus did not evolve naturally from this sample, and left open the question of where it did come from. So it's the first thought, and then we've had more revelations on that just in recent weeks. We've had this new details from the earlier drafts of the 2018 diffuse proposal. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with that. This is a very key piece of information. It was a year before the pandemic, a proposal that was written by Ralph Baric of University of North Carolina, and in conjunction with it was a collaboration with the WIV, but it was definitely being driven by him and his team in the States to take a coronavirus and insert into it a spike protein with a furin cleavage site, very much like, well, almost identical to SARS-CoV-2. So essentially, it was a proposal to create, if you like, SARS-CoV-2. We've known about that for some time, but recent weeks, earlier drafts have come out, some more information about that, and it's become, and the underlying structure of how they put it together in 6 pieces. Alex Washburn has been doing some amazing work on that. As 6 that they've identified that it was going to be put together in 6 pieces, and this confirms earlier work that Alex had done, where he had identified what appeared to be the 6 pieces of SARS-CoV-2 with the virus. 6 pieces in the virus. So there's this revelation. So I think it's becoming clearer and clearer all the time that. If it wasn't clear already, that the virus was made in a lab, but crucially with these revelations is becoming clear that, or at least it's looking more and more like that the lab that must have been intrinsically involved in designing that and in doing the underlying technical work for it must have been Ralph Barrick's lab in the UNC, University of North Carolina, because basically the virologists are all agreed that his is the only lab, and he's the only person. His team are the only ones with the technical expertise to have done that work to actually design it and design it, and I was going to say create it, but actually it could be having had the design work done. In principle, the actual putting it together could be done somewhere else. So it's not determinative of where it was actually being worked on, but it's become increasingly clear, and even more so in the last week, that this American lab, this American team, Ralph Barrick and co, must be intrinsically involved with the creation of this virus. That obviously leaves big questions of how it ended up causing its first outbreak in Wuhan, in a city in the middle of China. If you've got this close involvement of this American team, and there's all kinds of scenarios that could have produced that could have ended up with that happening. Big questions around that. But I think the important thing is that everyone is really been, in terms of the lab leak, has been really focused on the Wuhan lab and what's going on with the Chinese team, and we've seen that especially with the output that's been coming out from the Senate and from a guy called Robert Kadlec, who's one of the main intelligence linked people who's been really pushing the lab leak theory from early on. He wrote the Muddy Waters report for the Senate committee, which really pushed the lab leak. That was 2022, I think. So just over a year ago. So really pushing that, and all the attention from him and from the Republicans and those in the Senate has really been on China, and it's been part of the China is evil agenda, which I have no desire or wish to defend China by any means. But the point is that it is tied up with that agenda, and so there hasn't been so much focus on actually what role. And people talk about the Americans funding. There's been an emphasis on Fauci funding the work in China and Wuhan, and that is absolutely true, and that needs to be properly examined. But actually, the role of Ralph Barrick and the American scientists and virologists in actually designing and creating the virus has been totally neglected, and yet we know that the World Health Organization's own no, it's not the World Health Organization, the Lancet's commission looking at the origin of the virus, which was headed up by what's his name? Jeffrey. Do you remember his name? Jeffrey. name's going in my head. The Economist. Anyway, he was leading the Lancet's investigation into it, and he disbanded the investigation and said that there was no point in doing it because he said that the American scientists were not cooperating. He said they were not cooperating with the investigation, and so there was no point in doing it. But he knew they were hiding something. So there is something. So we don't know exactly what happened. We don't know how it was created, and we don't know how it ended up in Wuhan. But it is very clear now that we mustn't only be looking at the role of the WIV Wuhan and Xi Zhengli, but we also need to be looking at the role that the American scientists played as well.
Yeah. So I've been in the background as you speak, and I thank you so much for speaking authoritatively. I've had Jim Haslam's article, and I also posted my own from Brownstone. Mine is EcoHealth Alliance's Wuhan dalliances, and there have been a fair number. I had on Andrew Huff, PhD, about a few months ago, 3-4 months ago, and he worked with EcoHealth Alliance back in the day, around 2015 through 17 or so, and his theory is that it was spy versus spy. I don't know if you ever saw the Prohias cartoon book by that same name, Spy versus Spy. It's fascinating. He was an ex-Cuban. He wrote for Mad Magazine, so where they published these books. But it's all spy work. The spy, everybody's they're doing these things, to counter each other, and at the same time, the one acknowledges the other one's countering that. So it's kind of this multi-layered jewel box of intrigue and confusion. And so the concept Huff has is that EcoHealth Alliance was basically a CIA cutout that we could watch what's going on in Wuhan. They were going to be doing this stuff anyway, and we might as well have feet on the ground, eyes, on the prize, and so on, to be able to see what they're doing there. Whereas the Chinese essentially knew this, but wanted to co-opt our greater technological sense and sensibilities and abilities to watch EcoHealth Alliance and nurture them to do their own, bioweapon-ish kind of things. And of course, it's hard to prove that kind of thing, but I just put that out there. I think that with Watergate, famously, it was always not the crime, it was the cover-up that was the bad thing. Before we segue to the concept of whether there was a pandemic, I'm just curious, what is the level of the cover-ups being exposed, both in the UK, globally, and or the US?
So we had the cover-up. So the most obvious cover-up was the Fauci-led, and actually Barrick and Peter Daszak for the EcoHealth Alliance were involved in that as well. At the end of January 2020, beginning of February, that famous cover-up of the lab origin and pushing, very effective for a year or so, pushing of the zoonotic, the animal, the wet market theory, the animal spillover theory of the origin. So there was a real push to do that, and there's still people, the Zoonati as we call them, who are really pushing that attempt to cover it up. But there was a real concerted effort there to cover up the obvious lab origin of it. There's also, I think, there's a cover up of early spread. There's been especially in America, very, very few studies to look into to what extent SARS-CoV-2 was circulating in the later months of 2019, or even earlier. I don't think it was around very much earlier, but there's been no, but certainly in the second half of 2019, no wastewater studies. There was one Red Cross blood antibody study, but no follow-up. Nothing looking at bank samples, so that it does feel like, and that's of course part of the lockdown, the COVID lockdown agenda, where if the virus was circulating globally or in the US for months over that winter and over that autumn and winter, then the whole idea of locking down to stop it from coming in, and that whole narrative of it's coming over from China, we must lock down before it gets here, etc., is obviously total nonsense. So there is a feeling that that the CDC and the authorities in America don't want to know and are suppressing any attempt to look into early spread. And of course, there's suppression. There's obvious suppression of problems with the vaccines, and in particular, in addition to that, and as part of that, any link that they might have with the extraordinary levels of excess deaths we've been experiencing since the rollout. They just won't release. They won't release the record level data for impartial researchers to have a look to what extent the excess deaths are concentrated in the vaccinated. After several years of this happening, so it was 2.5 years, I think, into seeing these excess deaths, these non-COVID excess deaths, and we still don't have data to be able to properly compare, to be able to look at to what extent it's affecting vaccinated more than unvaccinated. So so some real, and I'm sure there's more as well, but they're pretty obvious areas where there's been this kind of suppression in line with the narrative.
So, amongst the our team, as it were, of Lockdown Sceptics, there's currently the concept that there was no pandemic. Have you followed this particular line of thought? And can you tell us what definitionally is intended by that crowd?
Yeah, sure. So they mean various different things. The most obvious problem with the term pandemic is that the pandemic was, and this is in a way the most mainstream version of that claim, is that the term pandemic was infamously redefined by the World Health Organization in 2009 in order to make swine flu qualify as a pandemic. They removed the requirement for it to cause a lot of deaths. So a pandemic no longer has to be deadly, which obviously makes a bit of a mockery of the whole idea of pandemic. Because why are we worried about a so-called pandemic if it's not killing anyone? But that was the big change. Then COVID, of course, is claimed to have killed millions of people. So there is a question of what counts as a pandemic. I mean, at the moment, a pandemic, there's this definition, but it changes. A pandemic is basically whatever the World Health Organization says it is, and so I think part of the worry is just this whole concept of a pandemic is just part of the fear narrative, because as soon as you have a pandemic, that's precisely when you can justify having an emergency, having extreme measures, having mandates, coercion, restrictions, all the stuff that we've had. They all tied up with this concept that there was this thing called a pandemic, rather than just a respiratory virus that may be slightly worse than the normal respiratory viruses, but basically does the same thing that all respiratory viruses do, which is have waves that are largely concentrated in the winter, right? So I think they're the most. I think they're probably the most mainstream and in my view defensible versions of the "there was no pandemic." And to some extent, I would sign up to both of those concerns about the concept of a pandemic. Although I do use the term myself because it's a very handy term for describing what we're talking about in terms of COVID. But there are other stronger versions which I'm more uncomfortable with, which would so obviously at one extreme there's the virus deniers who think the viruses don't exist, although they're very marginal, thank goodness. But the more mainstream version, or it's not really mainstream, but less marginal, I should say, is the idea that although there was a virus of some kind, it wasn't really novel. So they're pretty ambivalent about whether it was an engineered virus with a furin cleavage site that made it more infectious or more prone to infect more organs of the body, which is what is believed to be the case with the furin cleavage site and the with SARS-CoV-2. But they deny. So this is people like the people from Panda, which is an organization, a skeptical organization. They tend to deny that there is a novel virus that was unusually deadly. There was some kind of virus probably, but what they would say is that the excess deaths only they would claim. I don't think it's entirely true, but they would claim that excess deaths only started and only occurred where there were restrictions, and that all the excess deaths were a result of not of the virus as such, but of the response to it, and of the way that people were treated in hospitals and care homes, and the way that and then later on of the vaccines. So that's the kind of the so that builds on, of course, the point that these interventions did result in some people dying, that they were deadly, and that the treatments of COVID were often non-ideal, and in some cases very faulty. Lots of concern, of course, about ventilators and over-ventilation early on. So we've got all those ideas, but building on that and really taking it to quite an extreme point, really, which is to say that actually the virus itself wasn't really responsible for more deaths than normal. So that would be the claim, I think. And the main point that they point to, the main thing they point to back this up is they say, well, if it was circulating, the virus was circulating since November, at least 2019. It was there November, December, January, February, circulating globally. There's quite a bit of evidence of that. But we didn't see any spikes of death or no excess deaths. It was all the virus was around. And then all of a sudden, we get to March 2020, everyone locks down and everyone has deaths, excess deaths, big waves of deaths. And so their argument is that well, in that, the correlation isn't with the presence of the virus, it's with the presence of the response. So QED is the response that did it. I think there's some really good. There's really good reasons to think that the virus was behind the deaths. For example, the very thorough autopsy report from Germany of hundreds of autopsies of COVID patients from the first wave found that 86% of COVID deaths in the hospitals in Germany, they just took all the ones that had their autopsies, were a result of the virus killing them. They showed clear signs of being killed by the virus. 50 or just over 50% of them clearly a viral pneumonia that had killed them, and then a further 30%, and a further third being multi-organ failure subsequent to the viral pneumonia and virus infection, and then around 14%, or 16%, being misclassified, so not actually a COVID death. And I'm inclined to accept that evidence and the fact that it seems that there really was, for whatever reason, big viral surges in the March 2020. You can see that in various data. For whatever reason, the virus didn't surge in most places during that winter, even though it was around. It only surged. Maybe it was because they had mutations and new variants that took root. We don't entirely fully understand viruses and why they surge at certain times, and why they become dominant at certain times and aren't there and aren't at others, even though they're there. So I just see that as one of the things that we don't fully understand. But there's clear evidence there were surges of the virus in the March 2020, and then there's clear evidence from things like autopsies that it really was the virus killing most of the people. That's not obviously to take away from the fact that there were a lot of deaths caused by other factors and mistreatment and faulty treatment and all of that kind of thing. So that would be my view, and that would be my take on the debate, really.
Yeah, there is a very long open letter to Will Jones of the Daily Sceptic by Jessica Hockett, whom I've had on the show. And here it is, very long letter regarding ventilator and iatrogenic deaths in New York City. And she was on with Jonathan Engler of the UK. And I'm wondering, did you ever get to see her very long letter? And maybe your responses have already been implicit in what you've said, but do you have anything particular to discuss regarding her letter?
Yeah, I did read that. Yeah, so it was flattering to get a very long letter from Jessica. I think she was responding to my article I'd written about. I looked at the data for New York City and found, I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head. Basically, if you looked at the proportion of people who were on a ventilator in the proportion of people who died with COVID in New York on a ventilator was only about a fifth, I believe, of the total number who died. And so my point was that even if and I do think they did overventilate in overuse ventilators in New York, but even so, even if the ventilators killed every single person who was put on them, and actually it was close to that, it was something like 97%, it would still only account for around for a minority. For I think it was around a fifth, but I haven't looked at that recently, of the COVID deaths in New York, and so it couldn't be. So the ventilators couldn't be the explanation for that extraordinary death event in New York. And in fact, a more recent article from Jessica and her colleagues on that actually tacitly admitted a number of my points, and they basically said actually it doesn't correlate with the interventions either, and they started saying that actually we think there may be something wrong with the data, was their more recent article, because it doesn't make sense, and I kind of saw that as tacitly accepting perhaps some of the points that I've made, because they were now saying actually we think there needs to be another explanation. So
well, thank you so much. I very much appreciate your time. Love to have you back on sometime. I think you're a great discourser and knowledge-based source for us, and I appreciate your work.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to come on.